The evening had grown heavy with rain, a relentless drizzle that turned the narrow streets of Bloomsbury into a glistening labyrinth of reflections. The lamps along Bedford Square shone dimly through the mist, casting halos of pale light onto the wet pavement. At number 42, the home of the late Sir Basil Hearn, the atmosphere inside matched the gloom outside. It was here, on this sodden Tuesday evening, that the mystery began, one which the coroner would later describe, with reluctant admiration, as an affair wrapped in deliberate perversity. Sir Basil Hearn was no ordinary man. A barrister of fearsome reputation, wealthy and notoriously private. He had retired from public life, some 10 years earlier after a scandal, whispered more than spoken of in the Inns of Court. He lived alone in the great square house, attended only by a manservant of 30 years' loyalty, Hammond, and a housekeeper who kept herself as invisible as her duties would allow. On this particular evening, Hammond had found himself uneasy. Sir Basil had dismissed him unusually early, instructing that he was not to be disturbed until the following morning. The order was strange, but not unprecedented, and Hammond obeyed. It was only when dawn came, and no sound issued from Sir Basil's study, that the old servant grew alarmed. The study on the second floor was locked from within. Hammond pounded upon the door, received no reply, and finally fetched Mrs. Price, the housekeeper. Together they forced the door. What met them froze both in terror and incomprehension. Sir Basil sat at his writing desk, head bowed, as though in slumber. Yet the pistol lying upon the blotter told otherwise, and the black stain spreading across his silk waistcoat spoke in silent testimony. Sir Basil Hearn was dead, shot neatly through the heart at close range. The room presented the first puzzle. Every door had been locked from the inside, every window fastened. The keys to both lay upon the desk, within the dead man's reach. There was no sign of forced entry. On the carpet at his feet lay a single sheet of paper, torn hastily in half, bearing only 3 words written in his bold hand. The testament fails. The rest of the page was blank. Of his will, or any testamentary documents, there was no trace in the room. Though Hammond swore Sir Basil had been working on some legal papers until late the previous night. Most curiously of all, upon the blotter beside the pistol lay a small ivory pawn, carved with exquisite precision. A chess piece out of place in such surroundings, and bearing no relation to Sir Basil's known habits. He never played chess, he had no set in the house. The police were summoned, and by mid-morning Inspector Underwood of Scotland Yard was pacing the study, his keen eyes darting from floor to ceiling. He muttered half aloud, "Locked from the inside. No suicide note, only this cryptic message. A pawn left behind. Where is the testament? If this is murder, it is devilishly contrived. If it is suicide, it is unlike any I've seen." Hammond, white-faced and trembling, insisted his master had been in excellent health. "He spoke of business, sir, business that must be put in order this very week. He said there was not a moment to lose." Mrs. Price could add little, except that she had heard footsteps overhead long after Hammond retired. "But I thought it only Sir Basil pacing, as was his way," she murmured. The coroner's man, after a brief examination, announced that death had occurred somewhere between 11 o'clock and midnight. The pistol bore no fingerprints, not even those of the deceased. The pawn, too, was clean. Word spread quickly, as it does when wealth and scandal mingle. By noon a solicitor named Mr. Hargreaves had arrived, pale and tight-lipped, demanding to know whether a will had been discovered. He explained that Sir Basil had sent for him only days earlier, insisting upon changes to his testament. The new draft, however, had never been signed. "Without it," Hargreaves said gravely, "the old will stands, and that, gentlemen, is bound to cause trouble. Trouble, indeed. For the old will left the bulk of the Hearn fortune to a distant cousin, Captain Arthur Hearn, a man of disreputable habits and considerable debts. The new draft, by contrast, would have divided the estate among several charities, with a modest annuity left for Hammond and Mrs. Price. Sir Basil was determined that no wastrel should squander his fortune. Hargreaves remarked, "If he has destroyed the draft and left only that cryptic note, it may mean he changed his mind." But the torn page on the floor suggested otherwise. Why write? The testament fails, unless to signal interference. By late afternoon, suspicions multiplied like shadows. Captain Arthur Hearn, summoned hastily from his club, arrived in high spirits, his ruddy face showing little grief. He feigned shock at the death, but showed keen interest in the question of the will. If the old man died intestate, he muttered, "Well, the law must take its course. He was always eccentric, you know." Hargreaves frowned at this display, while Hammond looked ready to strike the captain down. The pawn, meanwhile, remained an enigma. None of those present could account for it. "Perhaps a token," suggested Underwood skeptically. "Or perhaps our murderer's idea of a calling card." Yet one feature of the scene gnawed at the inspector's mind. Though the pistol lay neatly upon the desk, Sir Basil's body slumped at an odd angle, as though he had turned suddenly at the moment of death. The inkstand had been knocked askew, and a blot of fresh ink stained his sleeve. He might have been writing, interrupted, startled, and then shot. But by whom? If no one could have entered, and why leave behind a single chess piece when not a board nor another man in the household cared for the game? By evening, the case was whispered about in every corner of London. Some declared it suicide, pointing to Sir Basil's solitary habits and the absence of forced entry. Others swore it must be murder, citing the missing will and the pawn as deliberate misdirections. The newspapers clamored for sensation, their headlines declaring mysterious death of retired barrister. "Pawn found beside body!" Inspector Underwood, however, was less concerned with headlines than with the gnawing suspicion that he was already playing a game against a mind far cleverer than the ordinary criminal. For when the study was searched once more, under every book and behind every drawer, no testament was found. The safe stood open and empty, its lock untouched. The new draft of the will, which Hargreaves swore he had left with Sir Basil, had vanished into thin air, and the pawn, though at first seeming trivial, now appeared to mock them, silent, white, and patient, as though the first move in a long and perilous match had already been played. The rain had lessened by the following morning, though the mist still hung low over Bedford Square, muffling the rumble of carts and the clatter of hooves. Inside number 42, the air was close and oppressive, as though the house itself had absorbed the weight of the mystery. Inspector Underwood, tired from a sleepless night, was seated in the study once more, reviewing his notes with the weary patience of a man who knew the public would demand quick answers where none could yet be given. He had already summoned the Yard's photographer, arranged for statements from the servants, and ordered the pawn and pistol to be examined. Still, the problem remained insoluble. How could a man be shot in a locked room, with no sign of entry, and with a will that had simply vanished? It was in this atmosphere that Lord Peter Wimsey arrived, his presence unlooked for yet somehow inevitable. He came lightly up the steps, immaculate as ever in tweed suit and spats, his monocle gleaming faintly in the pale light. Hammond opened the door to him, hesitated, and then admitted him with the air of one who surrenders to inevitability. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but the inspector is upstairs. He may not be expecting." "That's all right, Hammond. said Whimsy cheerfully. "I seldom am expected, which is one of my few charms. Now don't look so haggard, my dear fellow. I dare say we shall find your master's affairs not quite so dismal as they appear." Inspector Underwood greeted him with a mixture of relief and irritation. "I suppose you've heard, my lord. The papers have been full of it already." Whimsy, adjusting his monocle, glanced around the room. "Yes. Yes. Pawn at the scene of crime, that sort of thing. Dreadfully exciting. Now then, what have we here?" He crossed lightly to the desk, bent over the blotter, and picked up the ivory pawn, holding it delicately between finger and thumb. "A pretty little carving. Not ivory from a common set, I think. See the fine detailing. Probably part of a hand-crafted set. Not the sort of thing one finds in the toy shops. Curious, though, that only one piece should appear here." "The devil's in it," muttered Underwood. "No one in the house plays chess. No set has been found anywhere." Whimsy replaced the pawn carefully. So either Sir Basil suddenly developed a taste for the game, or someone left this behind. As a clue, or perhaps as a joke. A poor sort of joke, eh? He wandered to the window, running his hand over the latch. "Quite secure. And the key, you say, was on the desk when you entered?" "Just so." "And fingerprints on the pistol?" "None. Wiped clean." Whimsy gave a soft whistle. "Now, that is artistry. A suicide, if genuine, generally leaves a very grubby pistol indeed. The man's last thoughts are not of wiping it down like a dinner knife." He glanced back at the body, still respectfully covered but not yet removed. "And the angle of that wound, may I?" Without waiting for leave, he stooped, drew the shroud back just enough, and studied the position of the torso. The bullet entered squarely through the heart, but the body slumps sideways, not forward. Suggests he turned to face someone standing just here. He indicated a spot near the desk's corner. "But if the shot was fired from that position, where is our someone?" "Vanished like smoke." He began moving about the room, examining what Underwood had already examined, but with a different eye, lingering on the inkstand, the scattered blotter sheets, the faint smudge of ink on Sir Basil's sleeve. He was writing, interrupted, and turned. He drops his pen, knocks the inkstand askew, and bang. Yes, that fits. But what was he writing? Not this torn sheet, that seems too deliberate. A man in haste scrawls. He does not compose gnomic riddles like the Testament fails. No. This has the flavor of something prepared, perhaps even staged. He glanced toward Hammond, who stood in the doorway, pale but attentive. "Tell me, Hammond, did your master ever use chessmen as paperweights?" Hammond shook his head firmly. "Never, my lord. He disliked clutter, and there was no chess set in the house that I swear." "Just so. Then our pawn comes from outside. Now, that is more interesting than it looks." Whimsy moved to the safe, its door gaping open, shelves empty. "Inspector, was the safe locked when you found it?" "It was shut, but not locked. Nothing inside. No sign of tampering. Yet Mr. Hargreaves insists a draft of the new will was kept here." Either Sir Basil destroyed it himself, or someone removed it before he died." He tapped the steel door lightly. "No scratches, no forcing. Someone had the combination then. Did Sir Basil keep it to himself, Hammond?" "Always, my lord. He trusted no one with it, not even me." Whimsy's eyes twinkled faintly. "Then either Sir Basil opened it of his own will, or he was persuaded." At this moment, Captain Arthur Hearn was announced, striding in with his usual air of brash entitlement. His eyes flickered uneasily at Whimsy, then rested greedily on the desk. "Well, Inspector, any news? Have you found the will?" "No, Captain," said Underwood stiffly. "We are still investigating. Dash it all, man, there must be some explanation. My cousin was eccentric, but he would hardly throw away a lifetime's work on charities. I expect the old will stand, eh? His tone was eager, almost triumphant. Whimsy studied him with mild curiosity. You seem remarkably sure of your cousin's intentions, Captain. Did he tell you so? Arthur flushed. Well, no. But family comes first, surely. Sometimes, murmured Whimsy. And sometimes last of all. It was then that Whimsy noticed something, small, almost invisible. On the sleeve of Arthur's coat, near the cuff, a faint trace of white powder. He leaned closer, affecting a cough, and observed more carefully. Yes, unmistakably, traces of chalk dust. Been playing billiards, Captain? He asked lightly. Arthur looked startled. What? Yes, last night at the club. How did you know? Lucky guess, said Whimsy cheerfully. But inwardly he noted the detail. Billiards chalk, easy enough. But the residue on the pawn he had examined earlier. A faint whiteness in the grooves, not ivory's natural sheen but something clinging to it. Chalk again. Coincidence or connection? Arthur, blustering, continued to press for details about the will, while Whimsy let his gaze wander. Mrs. Price was summoned to repeat her testimony, and Whimsy listened intently. You say you heard footsteps past midnight. Heavy or light? Light, my lord. Not Sir Basil's step. He was a heavier man. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. And yet you thought it was he, pacing as usual. Interesting. He glanced at Underwood. Inspector, do you happen to know where Captain Hearn was at midnight? Arthur stiffened. At the club. Naturally. Plenty of witnesses. Whimsy smiled. Naturally. When the servants withdrew, Whimsy returned to the desk and, with delicate care, lifted the torn sheet from the carpet. Notice the edges, Inspector. Torn hastily, but the ink is dry, long dry, more than a few hours. This was written well before last night, which means either Sir Basil prepared it earlier or someone planted it here. If planted, then by whom? If genuine, why conceal the rest of the page? He leaned back, the monocle gleaming. And meanwhile, our pawn waits patiently to tell us its story. A pawn, gentlemen, is seldom dangerous alone. But it heralds a game in progress. Someone has made the first move. Underwood sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. Then we are being toyed with. Indeed, said Whimsy softly. And the worst of it is, we cannot yet tell whether our opponent is careless enough to leave such a piece behind, or confident enough to do so deliberately. Either way, the deception has begun. I fancy we must watch every gesture, every word. For something here is not what it seems. He placed the pawn back on the blotter, as though returning it to its square, and gave a faint smile. Yes, Inspector, the game is on, and I should very much like to see how it develops. Whimsy remained in the study long after the first excitement had cooled, content to watch the ebb and flow of conversation as witnesses were brought in one by one. It was in such exchanges that truth most often slipped its mask. A careless phrase here, an over-eager denial there, told more than any direct confession. Inspector Underwood had summoned all who might have knowledge of Sir Basil's final hours, the housekeeper, Hammond the manservant, Mr. Hargreaves the solicitor, and Captain Arthur Hearn. Each entered with their own manner, and each revealed, in Whimsy's eyes, more than they intended. Mrs. Price came first, nervous and flustered, wringing her hands in her apron. She repeated what she had told the inspector, that she had retired early, leaving Hammond to attend Sir Basil, and that sometime after midnight she heard footsteps overhead. I thought nothing of it, my lord. Sir Basil often paced when troubled with his thoughts. It was light, quick, almost hurried, but who else could it be? Whimsy's eyes narrowed. You are certain it was past midnight? She hesitated. Nearer 1 o'clock, I should think. I had just put out my candle. And you did not see anyone leaving the house that night? No, my lord. The doors were all bolted when I rose. Wimsey smiled faintly. Bolted from the inside, you say? Then either our phantom walker vanished into thin air, or Sir Basil was not alone as late as you suppose. Mrs. Price crossed herself nervously and looked away. Hammond followed, grave and loyal in his testimony. He spoke firmly of his master's mood. Determined, not despairing. He was set upon his work, my lord, and spoke of it as though time pressed. He sent me away near 10 o'clock, saying I should not disturb him again until morning. Wimsey studied him over the rim of his monocle. And you obeyed? To the letter, my lord. I never left my room until the house was roused at dawn. Yet you heard no shot. Hammond shook his head. Not a sound. And I would have heard. For my room is but down the corridor. Underwood frowned. Then the pistol must have been muffled somehow. Wimsey considered this, but said nothing. Instead, he leaned closer. Tell me, Hammond, do you know if your master ever met Captain Hearn in these past weeks? Hammond's lips tightened. Not here, my lord. Sir Basil had no love for the captain's company. If they met, it was not under this roof. So you would say their relations were strained. Bitter cold, my lord. Sir Basil despised his ways. Hammond's loyalty rang true, yet Wimsey noted the slight quiver in his voice when he spoke of the will. A servant who stood to lose a promised annuity might not murder for greed, but he might shade his recollections to preserve his master's honor. Mr. Hargreaves the solicitor arrived next, his narrow face drawn with professional severity. He carried a leather case, though its contents were of no immediate use. My Lord Inspector, I must repeat what I said before. Sir Basil was drafting a new testament, which would have disinherited Captain Hearn entirely. The draft was not signed. I left it here in the safe 3 nights ago. Where it is now, I cannot say. Wimsey eyed him thoughtfully. You were alone with Sir Basil when you brought it? Yes. And he gave no hint of destroying it. On the contrary, he pressed me to return within the week, so it might be finalized. So the draft vanishes, Sir Basil is found dead, and the old will, most convenient to one party, remains. An unfortunate coincidence, don't you think? Hargreaves colored faintly. The law does not trade in coincidences. My lord. Said Wimsey softly, but murderers sometimes do. When Captain Arthur Hearn entered once more, he carried with him the air of a man rehearsed. His manner was all eagerness to be helpful, though the gleam in his eye betrayed impatience. Look here. Inspector, I'll tell you everything straight. I was at my club last night, never left till after 2. You may ask half a dozen fellows to confirm it. Poor Basil must have gone mad in the end. Eccentric old boy, always was. This business of the will, it's a pity of course, but perhaps it was too late to change. The law must stand. Wimsey leaned against the mantelpiece, watching him with lazy interest. Indeed. But tell me, Captain, when last did you see Sir Basil alive? Not for weeks, months perhaps. He never welcomed me. And yet you seem very sure of his intentions. Arthur flushed. Family instinct, my lord. Blood ties count, even if Basil didn't care to admit it. Wimsey tilted his head. Family instinct, or family interest. You inherit a considerable fortune under the old will. That must be a comfort in your grief. Arthur bristled. You imply. Oh, I imply nothing at all, said Wimsey lightly. But tell me, did you play billiards last night? Arthur blinked. Yes, of course. I told you. Oh. Yes, you did. Forgive me. I only wondered whether you played a full match or merely idled at the table. One sleeve collects chalk very easily, don't you find? Arthur glanced quickly at his cuff, then laughed too loudly. Details, my lord. I hardly notice such things. Whimsy's gaze lingered a moment longer than was comfortable. When the captain had gone, Underwood muttered, "He is glib enough, but his alibi may stand. The club will swear to him." "Yes," said Whimsy slowly, "but one may dine at a club at 8, play a little billiards, step out for an hour or two, and return by midnight, still to be seen after 2. An alibi may be stitched of many parts. We must examine its seams." His eyes strayed to the pawn, still resting mutely upon the desk. "And meanwhile, our little ivory friend waits to be explained." Late that afternoon, Whimsy asked Mrs. Price and Hammond to join him once more, together this time. He placed the pawn upon the table between them. "Now look well at this. Have either of you seen it before?" Hammond swore he had not. Mrs. Price bit her lip. "It reminds me, my lord, I did see a small box in Sir Basil's drawer last week, when I dusted. Wooden, with other little pieces inside. I thought nothing of it." Hammond looked chess-set. "Impossible." He despised games. Mrs. Price looked uncertain. "I may be mistaken. Perhaps it was some ornament." Whimsy regarded her sharply. "And did you tell the inspector this before?" She flushed. "No, my lord. I was not sure, or reluctant." She stammered a denial, but Whimsy's gaze did not soften. "Very well. Truth often hides behind uncertainty. We shall see." The contradictions were mounting. Hammond insisting there was no set, Mrs. Price half recalling one. Hargreaves swearing to the existence of a will that could no longer be found, Arthur proclaiming an alibi too neatly arranged. Each voice told a story. Yet none harmonized. And beneath their words ran undercurrents, loyalty shading into concealment, eagerness hardening into greed, forgetfulness masking knowledge. Whimsy, drawing his monocle along its chain, smiled faintly. "Yes, yes, each voice sings a different tune. Somewhere in the discord lies our truth. But which note is false? And which has been struck too loudly?" The room grew quieter once the witnesses had dispersed, though their words lingered in the air like faint smoke. Whimsy sat at the desk, idly rolling the ivory pawn between his fingers, as if the piece itself might whisper the truth, if only handled long enough. Inspector Underwood leaned against the mantel, chewing his moustache in frustration. "Every one of them has reason to lie," he muttered. "The solicitor wants to protect his reputation, the servants want their annuities, and the captain, well, his motive is plain enough. Yet the facts won't hang together." "Motives are always abundant," said Whimsy lightly. "It is the means that are rare. Still, it is worth sketching the outlines of our little maze." He laid the pawn down as though it were the center of a chessboard. "Here sits Sir Basil, obstinate as a rook. Around him, his players, Captain Arthur, whose debts would be handsomely paid by the old will. Hammond faithful perhaps, but with much to gain under the New Testament. Mrs. Price, who hints at things seen and not spoken, perhaps from fear of implication. And Mr. Hargreaves, who insists on the draft's existence, perhaps truthfully, perhaps to shield himself from suspicion of incompetence. All four are entangled. But how? Underwood grunted. Captain Arthur seems the strongest suspect. He inherits if the old will stands, he has no love lost for his cousin. And he is a bad lot besides. Whimsy cocked his head. True. And yet the man is clumsy in manner. Could such a one contrive a locked room mystery, wipe a pistol clean, and leave behind a symbolic clue? That smacks of artistry, not brute greed. Arthur is a blunt instrument. Our crime was wrought with delicacy. He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the fog now thickening once more. Consider Hammond. His loyalty is touching, but loyalty sometimes curdles into resentment. 30 years of service, and only now his master grants him security in a will. Suppose Sir Basil wavered, suppose Hammond feared the draft would be withdrawn. Might he have acted to prevent its destruction? Yet if so, why remove the will itself? He would have wanted it preserved. Underwood nodded slowly. And Mrs. Price, she seems harmless enough. But her story of the chess pieces contradicts Hammond's. If there was a set, why did he not know of it? If there was not, why does she imagine one? Either way, one of them conceals something, and Hargreaves, Whimsy added softly. His tale is plausible. But he alone insists the draft was in the safe. If Sir Basil destroyed it himself, Hargreaves's competence would not be questioned. Yet if it was stolen, Hargreaves stands clear of blame. Too neat. He has a motive to swear to its existence, whether it be true or not. Underwood's brow furrowed. So every one of them profits by some version of events. Yet how do we reconcile it? Sir Basil dead in a locked room, the pawn beside him. The message torn and cryptic. Whimsy tapped the pawn thoughtfully. Murderers often betray themselves not by their motives, which are common, but by their symbols. Why a pawn? Why not a rook, or a knight, or none at all? A pawn is the weakest piece, yet it may advance and be transformed. It suggests beginning, not ending. Someone has made a first move. Which of our four fancies himself clever enough to play such a game? The following day brought fresh threads. A messenger from the club confirmed Captain Arthur's presence there after midnight, but with a caveat. He had been absent between 11 and 12, unaccounted for. Slipped out for air, he said, the man reported. Returned later looking flushed. Underwood seized on this eagerly. There, you see, he had time to come here, shoot his cousin, and be back at the club before 1. Whimsy, however, looked less satisfied. Possible, yes. But does it explain the missing draft? Or the pawn? Or the absence of fingerprints? It seems too convenient. Captain Arthur may be greedy and reckless, but subtlety is not his forte. Meanwhile, a careful search of the servants' quarters produced another puzzle. In Mrs. Price's sewing basket lay a scrap of cloth, stained faintly with ink. The same black as that spilled upon Sir Basil's desk. When confronted, she grew pale. I swear, my lord, I found it on the landing outside the study, the morning after. I thought it some rag of Sir Basil's, and I kept it without thinking. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Not without thinking, Mrs. Price. You kept it because you feared what it meant. You thought it might be used against you. She burst into tears, denying any part in the crime. Yet her story proved one thing. Someone had handled ink that night, someone careless enough to drop a stained rag just outside the locked door. Hargreaves, when pressed again, grew defensive. The draft must have been stolen. I know it existed. Sir Basil signed nothing, but the text was complete. Whimsy asked quietly, and who else knew of its provisions? Only Sir Basil, myself and... He hesitated. And Hammond, I suppose. He overheard parts of our discussion. Sir Basil trusted him, oddly enough. Hammond denied overhearing, but his denial was too swift, too sharp. Piece by piece, the web thickened. Greed could account for Arthur's eagerness. Fear might explain Mrs. Price's trembling half-truths. Resentment or desperation might drive Hammond. Professional pride and concealment could taint Hargreaves. But no single theory fitted all the facts. Each motive overlapped, contradicting and complementing the others, like threads in a knot. That evening, Whimsy sat again before the desk, gazing at the pawn beneath the lamplight. We have Inspector, a puzzle in which every suspect could be guilty, yet none alone could have contrived it. Greed, fear, pride, resentment, they all meet here in this locked room. Our task is not to ask who profited most, but who possessed both the nerve and the imagination to make the first move. He turned the pawn slowly in his fingers, the faint traces of chalk dust catching in the light. Yes, someone began a game, and before long, we must discover who sits across the board. The discovery of the ink-stained rag became the talk of the household. Underwood, who had grown wary of shadows and half-truths, seized on it as the long-awaited crack in the wall of mystery. Mrs. Price's trembling account seemed, to his mind, almost a confession. She found it outside the study, she says, he told Whimsy with grim satisfaction. But she kept it hidden. That alone is damning. She feared exposure because she knew what it meant. Whimsy, sitting with his long legs stretched across the hearthrug, regarded the inspector with lazy amusement. Damning? My dear fellow, it proves only that Mrs. Price has more imagination than courage. She thought the rag might draw suspicion, so she hid it. Not a very clever thing, but hardly proof of murder. Besides, if she had handled ink in the room that night, where is the motive? She inherits nothing, gains nothing. A housekeeper rarely shoots her master to alter a will. But Underwood was not to be swayed. He had the rag examined, and traces of Sir Basil's hand confirmed that the ink matched the spilled blot upon the desk. To the Yard, the matter seemed plain Mrs. Price had meddled in the study after Sir Basil's death, perhaps attempting to cover for Hammond, or perhaps caught up in a quarrel of which no one yet spoke. A warrant was issued, and Mrs. Price, weeping and protesting, was taken away. The newspapers rejoiced. Housekeeper in custody, pawn mystery explained. Blared the morning editions. Rumors swelled that jealousy or blackmail had driven her to desperation. Hammond, stricken with fury, swore his mistress innocent. Hargreaves washed his hands of the whole matter. Captain Arthur, in high spirits, declared the affair settled at last. These things always come down to the servants, he said over his port at the club. They see too much, know too much, and sooner or later, it's their undoing. Whimsy, however, sat silent through the uproar, his eyes half closed behind the monocle. He visited Mrs. Price in her cell, listened to her sobbing protestations, and came away thoughtful. She is frightened enough to be guilty, he remarked to Underwood afterward, but not clever enough to have contrived the scene in the study. A woman who hides a rag because she thinks it suspicious does not wipe a pistol clean of fingerprints. Nor does she vanish a draft from a safe without leaving a trace. No, no, she is a scapegoat, and a willing one, in that she trembles at shadows. Someone has pushed her into the light to mask their own darkness. Underwood bristled. The Yard is satisfied, my lord. The evidence is tangible. Tangible, yes, said Whimsy softly, but not sufficient. Consider again the pawn. It was left deliberately, I am sure of it. Would Mrs. Price think of such symbolism? Would she even own such a piece? And the rag, too convenient, too perfectly placed outside the door, as if dropped for us to find. My dear Inspector, we are being played with. Someone has arranged this little farce to mislead us. Yet events pressed on, and for a brief time the case seemed closed. The coroner's inquest, hastily convened, pointed to foul play with strong suspicion falling upon the housekeeper. The jury murmured its assent. Captain Arthur preened himself as the heir presumptive, already hinting to acquaintances of the improvements he would make to the Bedford Square house. Hargreaves, more soberly, prepared for legal contests over the will, but even he confessed relief that a culprit had been found. Hammond alone remained unconvinced, his face set with stubborn loyalty. Whimsy moved quietly through it all, asking small questions, noting details overlooked. He paid another visit to the club, where Arthur kept his alibi, speaking to a porter who recalled the captain slipping out by a side entrance. He examined again the pawn under a magnifying glass, observing the faint chalk in its grooves and the peculiar pattern of wear upon its base. He even wandered the neighborhood at night, tracing the shortest routes between the club and Bedford Square. A man could walk it in 20 minutes, he murmured to himself. Ample time for a call between 11 and 12. The false victory reached its height when Mrs. Price, broken by confinement, admitted that she had once overheard Sir Basil quarreling with Hammond about money. The admission sent a ripple of triumph through the yard. Underwood pressed his advantage, declaring the matter essentially settled. One of them, or both together, contrived the thing, he said. The housekeeper hides evidence, the servant quarrels with his master. It all fits. But Wimsey shook his head. It fits too neatly. Motives that clash, stories that contradict, yet all lead us back to the servants. Too easy, Inspector, much too easy. Real life seldom ties itself so prettily with string. Somewhere behind them stands another hand, one clever enough to place a pawn upon the board and wait while we chase shadows. The waiting hand soon revealed itself in a subtle way. A letter arrived for Hargreaves, posted the morning after Sir Basil's death, written in Sir Basil's own bold script. It contained but a single sentence. The testament fails. Destroy the draft. Hargreaves produced it with shaking fingers. You see, my lord, my client intended to revoke his intentions. The draft is worthless. There can be no contest. The old will stands. Underwood exhaled in satisfaction. There, Sir Basil himself confirms it. Our prisoner's guilt is certain, and the estate passes without difficulty. But Wimsey's brow furrowed. He read the letter twice, then a third time. Curious. Very curious indeed. For the ink on this is fresh, far fresher than it should be, considering the date of posting, and the words are identical to those on the torn sheet found beside his body. Too identical. One might say, copied. He turned the page under the light, revealing faint indentations as though traced from another. No, Inspector. This is no victory. It is another move in the game. That night, alone in his chambers, Wimsey laid out the evidence as though upon a chessboard: the pawn, the rag, the pistol, the missing draft, the duplicate phrases. Each piece pointed, not to closure, but to artifice. Someone was guiding the investigation with a steady hand, planting evidence, shaping outcomes, ensuring suspicion fell where it was most convenient. And somewhere, just beyond the lamplight, that someone waited, watching the others stumble, preparing their final stroke. The game is far from over, Wimsey murmured, replacing the pawn upon the center square of his board. In fact, I dare say it has only begun. The forged letter sat heavy on Wimsey's desk. A reminder that the case was less about truth than about appearances carefully manufactured. He stared at the faint impressions left upon the page, and felt the cold thrill of recognition. This was not a sudden impulse crime, not a quarrel boiling over into violence, but the culmination of a plan spun long before the pistol was fired. The pawn on the chessboard was not merely a clue. It was a signature. He returned to Bedford Square under the pretext of inspecting the study once more. The police had cleared away most of their apparatus, but the room still held its atmosphere of stale smoke and sudden death. His eye wandered over the desk, the shelves, the cabinets. Then it halted on the row of volumes pushed neatly against the wall, dust upon most, but one with a fresh mark, as though handled recently. He drew it out. It was a thin pamphlet, bound in cheap leather, Proceedings of the Old Bailey, 1897. Odd choice of bedtime reading for a baronet, Wimsey muttered. He turned the pages, and a name leapt out at him: Hargreaves, counsel for the defense. The case concerned a young man accused of embezzlement from a shipping concern. The accused had fled abroad, leaving his family ruined. Whimsy read on, tracing the fate of the accomplices. One, noted in the margin, had escaped all censure: Arthur Kellaway. Whimsy closed the book slowly. Arthur. Captain Arthur. The name struck like a spark in tinder. That evening, he sought out Parker at Scotland Yard, who, though burdened with other matters, agreed to assist. They dug into old archives, sifting through brittle files and ink-faded pages until the past came crawling back to life. Arthur Kellaway, it appeared, had indeed been involved in the scandal. He had altered his name to Arthur Vane after a discreet lapse of years and purchased his commission in the army. The embezzlement had never been fully unraveled, funds vanished, families broken, lives destroyed. And Hargreaves, then a young barrister, had defended him with surprising fervour, though unsuccessfully, for the principal culprit. "Good Lord," Parker muttered, "if this be the same man, he's carried a shadow for 30 years. And Sir Basil, what link had he with this ancient scandal?" Whimsy tapped the pamphlet thoughtfully. "Consider Sir Basil made his fortune in shipping. The very concern defrauded. Perhaps he lost money, perhaps more. That would explain why he never trusted Captain Arthur, yet tolerated him for family's sake, and why a draft will cutting him out entirely would prove intolerable. The past, my dear Parker, is not buried. It sits at the table with us, waiting for its cue." The next day, Whimsy contrived to meet Arthur in the smoking room of his club. The captain was his usual hearty self, full of talk of horses and regimental anecdotes. But at the mention of 1897 his glass trembled. Whimsy, with his most airy drawl, observed, curious, "How small the world is. I was reading an old trial report last night. Some fellow named Kellaway, dashed unfortunate with the jury. You don't happen to have known him, what?" Arthur's jaw stiffened, the cheer drained from his eyes, but he forced a laugh. "Kellaway? Never heard of the chap. One meets so many names in one's time, eh? Can't keep track of them all." Whimsy smiled, as if satisfied with the answer. Yet in his notebook later he wrote Denial too quick. Fear behind it. Connection certain. Meanwhile another thread tugged at the fabric. Hammond, still resolute in his innocence, approached Whimsy with a fragment of gossip overheard in the servants' hall. Sir Basil, God rest him, had dealings with Captain Arthur in years past, before the captain took his commission. There was talk of money, loans not repaid, investments sawed. "I never thought it mattered, but now it matters," Whimsy assured him. "It matters exceedingly." The detective turned next to Hargreaves. Over a quiet dinner he pressed gently, "You defended a certain young man in '97, I think. The records show it. Yet now you represent Sir Basil's interests against that very man's claim. Life weaves the oddest patterns." Hargreaves coloured, his fork unsteady. "I did my duty as a barrister, nothing more. My client was guilty, and the law took its course. I had no choice in his rehabilitation afterward." "Of course not," said Whimsy smoothly. "Yet Sir Basil must have known. Did he never speak of it?" The lawyer's silence was telling. At last he murmured, he hinted once, only once, that certain men were not to be trusted. But he would not elaborate. He despised scandal. Whimsy left him brooding and walked home in the fog, his mind assembling the fragments. Sir Basil had planned to disinherit Arthur. Arthur, burdened by a past he dared not see revealed, had every reason to prevent that draft reaching daylight. The pawn was not random, but symbolic. Arthur had always fancied himself a player of games, cleverer than his opponent. But if the pawn marked his signature, then the rag, the letter, the forged evidence. They were all the careful moves of a man who believed he was still in control of the board. Yet another shadow stirred. Research into the embezzlement case revealed that one more figure had been ruined by it, the father of Hammond, Sir Basil's valet. Old Hammond had lost his savings in the fraudulent scheme, dying in poverty. Young Hammond had entered service soon after, his loyalty to Sir Basil perhaps born of gratitude, or of necessity. Wimsey sat back with a low whistle. So the past touches them all. Hargreaves as defender, Arthur as culprit, Sir Basil as victim, Hammond as collateral. The circle closes, and within it lies our murderer. The revelation altered everything. The crime was no longer a simple struggle for inheritance. It was revenge deferred, debts unpaid, secrets preserved across decades. The shot in the study echoed from 1897, carrying the bitterness of betrayal into the present. When Wimsey laid these findings before Underwood, the inspector grew impatient. "You mean to tell me this tangle of ancient fraud has bearing on the case? The public will not stomach such cobwebs. We have our prisoner, and a jury will convict." But Wimsey only smiled faintly. "The public, my dear inspector, may be satisfied with cobwebs. I, however, prefer to catch the spider, and in this web the threads are old but strong. Watch closely. The next move will come not from the past, but from the present. Someone will act again, to cover what we are only just uncovering." Even as he spoke, he knew the game had entered a new phase. The past was no longer dormant, it had risen to claim its due. And the man who thought himself master of the board was about to be forced into a corner. Wimsey was not one to put his faith in mere routine. The official inquiries had marched forward with their usual pomp, files stacked neatly, suspects ticked off as though on a ledger. Yet what lay beneath the surface, he knew, was far more delicate, more susceptible to a touch of theatre than to the bludgeon of procedure. The past had shown its shadowy hand, but shadows alone were not proof. If he were to draw the true culprit into the open, he would need a method both subtle and unconventional. The idea came to him in the small hours as he leafed through his notebook for the 100th time. The pawn, the forged letter, the half-burned rag. Each bore the hallmark of someone convinced of his own cleverness. It was arrogance, not caution, that had betrayed them. Such a man, Wimsey reasoned, could not resist a challenge to his intellect. He must be tempted into showing his hand. Coaxed by nothing more than his own pride, the next afternoon he arranged a small gathering in Sir Basil's study, under the pretense of clarifying disputed details for the coroner's inquest. Hammond stood stiff at the door, watchful and subdued. Hargreaves sat in his accustomed corner, grave and nervous. Arthur lounged near the fireplace, pipe clenched between his teeth, affecting ease but betraying it by the restless drumming of his fingers on the mantelpiece. "I've been puzzling," Wimsey began lightly, as though the whole matter were a game of charades, over the peculiar little pawn left upon the desk. "A curious token, eh? One might call it an accident. But I confess I see design in it. Indeed, I've half a mind that it was meant as a challenge, a declaration of victory, as it were. Checkmate in a single move. The sort of thing a man would leave only if he fancied himself cleverer than his opponent." Arthur gave a short laugh, but it was too sharp, and his eyes flicked briefly toward the pawn in its evidence box. "You detectives see signs in everything," he said. "For all you know, Sir Basil left it there himself. He played chess often enough, didn't he?" "True," Wimsey replied, "but Sir Basil was never one to boast. No, the pawn speaks more of the killer than of the victim. In fact," and here Wimsey let his voice drop as though confiding a secret, "I have devised a little test. Each of you shall have a chance to prove your innocence or your guilt by one simple exercise. Nothing more than a puzzle, really. But puzzles have a way of betraying us. He produced a sheet of paper upon which he had copied the forged letter, its script precise, the phrases carefully chosen to mimic Sir Basil's hand. Beneath it, he had written 3 brief sentences in different hands, 2 copied from samples he had collected, 1 freshly invented in his own. "Here," he said, laying them out upon the desk, "are 3 imitations of the late baronet's writing. Only one is genuine. If you can spot it at a glance, you have the mind of a forger or of a man familiar with the original. Indulge me, gentlemen." Hargreaves, frowning, adjusted his spectacles and peered earnestly. He took his time, muttered something about the slope of the letters, and at last pointed to the wrong one. Hammond, with a shrug, glanced briefly and chose at random, declaring he had no eye for such matters. Arthur, however, leaned forward eagerly, his hand darting almost at once to the correct line. "That's the one," he said with confidence. "Any fool can see it. The others are clumsy." The room went still, Whimsy's eyes, bright and mocking, fixed upon him. "Indeed. Remarkable certainty, Captain. You've the eye of an expert. One might almost think you had compared Sir Basil's writing often enough to know it by heart." Arthur flushed, his bravado faltering. "Nonsense. Sheer luck, that's all." "Perhaps," said Whimsy, his tone still airy. "Yet luck, like handwriting, has its own peculiar style. And your luck, Captain, grows suspicious." He gathered up the papers, slipping them back into his case with a smile that was all politeness. "I thank you for humoring my whim. But let us not forget, the pawn remains. A small piece, easily overlooked yet often decisive. I wonder who placed it there, and why." The silence that followed was broken only by Hammond shifting uneasily at the door. Arthur lit his pipe with exaggerated calm, but the match trembled faintly between his fingers. Hargreaves, pale, pressed his lips together as though suppressing words he dared not utter. Later, as they dispersed, Parker drew Whimsy aside. "That was a trick worthy of a conjurer. You mean to say his quick answer proves guilt?" "Not proves, my dear fellow," Whimsy replied, "but reveals. A guilty man will betray himself not by what he hides, but by what he cannot resist showing." Arthur's confidence was too sharp, too ready. He could not bear to appear dull before us. "Pride is the lever by which I intend to move him. Given time, he will hang himself with his own rope." True enough, the ripple of that moment lingered. Over the next days, Whimsy noted subtle changes. Arthur, once boisterous, grew more guarded, though in his efforts at restraint he became clumsy, overcompensating with forced cheer. He avoided Hammond's eye, quarrelled with Hargreaves over trifles, and once, when Whimsy mentioned the Old Bailey trial in casual conversation, he snapped his pencil clean in 2. But the most telling sign came one evening when Whimsy, alone in the study, pretended to be absorbed in cataloguing Sir Basil's books. Arthur entered quietly, believing himself unobserved, and moved at once to the drawer where the pawn had once lain. Finding it empty, he swore softly, his face tightening. Then, seeing Whimsy rise from the desk with a look of bland surprise, he laughed too loudly and demanded a drink. It was enough. The unconventional clue, the forged writing game, had planted a seed of fear. Arthur had shown his hand, not by confession, but by reaction. The web was tightening, and Whimsy knew the next move would not be his to make. The captain, cornered, would strike again, and when he did, it would be the moment of truth. It was the following morning when Whimsy's suspicions hardened into certainty. He had risen earlier than usual, intending to revisit the evidence before Parker arrived, for something about the pawn, that tiny, mocking token, gnawed at him. He meant to study its position once more, the grain of the wood, the faint smudge near its base. But when he unlocked the drawer, where it had been carefully sealed in its little evidence box, his hand closed on emptiness. The box was gone. For a moment he stood quite still, every nerve alert. Then, slowly he shut the drawer again, his mind working rapidly. The pawn had not vanished of its own accord. Someone had taken it, and not merely for idle curiosity. That piece had become dangerous to the guilty. Its absence spoke volumes. He summoned Parker at once. "It has begun," he said quietly when his friend arrived. "The game grows desperate. We have crossed from observation into contest. The enemy has moved against us." Parker frowned. "The pawn's missing. But it was locked. Who had the key?" "Only Hammond and myself," replied Whimsy. "And I flatter myself I am not the thief." Which leaves either our diligent butler, or someone resourceful enough to secure his cooperation, witting or otherwise. They wasted no time in questioning Hammond. The old servant was pale with shock when told of the disappearance, protesting his innocence with the solemn dignity of a man whose entire life had been service. "My lord, I swear upon my honor, I have not touched it. No one entered the study save Mr. Arthur last evening, and then only for a word with you. I was at my post the whole time." "Indeed," murmured Whimsy, watching him keenly. "And yet the pawn has vanished. Curious. The house was searched from attic to cellar, but no trace of the missing box appeared. It was as if the evidence had been plucked out of existence." That afternoon, another blow fell. The forged letter, which Whimsy had carefully placed with the rest of the documents, was found singed and torn, as though someone had half-heartedly attempted to burn it before realizing the fire would draw attention. The edges were charred, the ink blurred, and though enough remained to prove its nature, the subtle details, the slant of the hand, the hesitation in the strokes, had been destroyed. Parker slammed his fist on the desk. "This is sabotage, plain and simple. Someone inside this house doesn't mean for the truth to come out. They're one step ahead of us." "Not ahead," said Whimsy softly, "but beside. Close enough to feel my breath upon their neck, and frightened enough to lash out clumsily. The pawn is gone, the letter half ruined. They know where to strike, but not how to do it cleanly. That betrays haste and fear." Yet the destruction shook the fragile balance of trust within the household. Hargreaves muttered bitterly that Hammond must be in league with Arthur. Hammond, affronted, declared that Hargreaves was the only one with free access to the study at night. Arthur, meanwhile, laughed it off with forced nonchalance, suggesting that Whimsy himself had misplaced the evidence in his eagerness for drama. "After all," he said with a sneer, "these things make splendid tales for the club, don't they, Lord Whimsy? Perhaps the pawn was never there at all." Whimsy let the insult pass, though his eyes gleamed dangerously. "My dear Captain, I only wish my imagination were so fertile. Allah's? Reality is quite dramatic enough." The atmosphere thickened with suspicion. Meals were strained, conversations clipped. Each man seemed to measure his words, guarding against hidden ears. The theft had made them all prisoners in the house, bound not by walls but by mistrust. That night Whimsy sat alone in the darkened study, the fire dying low. He had placed a sheet of clean paper upon the desk, weighted by an inkwell, and beside it he set his watch. Hours dragged, the silence broken only by the tick of the clock and the occasional creak of the old timbers. At 2:30, a shadow stirred at the door. The latch clicked softly, and a figure entered, moving with careful steps. Whimsy did not rise. He let the intruder draw nearer, closer to the desk, until the hand reached out toward the paper. Then, with a sudden flick, he snapped on the lamp. Arthur froze, his eyes wide, his hand still hovering above the desk. For a moment the mask slipped, revealing something raw and panicked beneath. Then he laughed, though the sound rang hollow. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Thought I'd write a note. Didn't mean to startle you. Quite understandable," Whimsy answered evenly. "Sleep is often elusive when one is troubled. But then, Captain, I cannot help wondering, why would a man reach for a blank sheet when his mind is so full of words already? Perhaps because he seeks to replace something lost, or to create what was destroyed." Arthur's hand trembled slightly before he thrust it into his pocket. "You're seeing phantoms, Whimsy. If you mean to accuse me, do it openly." "Accuse?" Whimsy's smile was thin. "I never accuse, I observe, and observation, my dear fellow, is patient. It does not falter when evidence vanishes. It sharpens." Arthur left without another word, but Whimsy knew the contest had reached a critical point. Someone had dared to tamper with the very heart of the case, and the stakes had risen accordingly. No longer was it merely a matter of unmasking a killer. Now it was a duel of wits played under the shadow of sabotage. When dawn broke, Whimsy found Parker waiting, wary-eyed but resolute. "We're losing ground," said Parker. "If more evidence disappears, we'll have nothing." "On the contrary," Whimsy replied, tapping his temple. "The thief has shown his hand. By destroying the pawn and spoiling the letter, he has told us precisely what he fears. And that, my dear Parker, is evidence no fire can consume. The battle lines were drawn. Somewhere within those walls, the true culprit struggled to cover his tracks. Yet with each desperate act he bound himself more tightly to the truth." Whimsy knew the time for subtle games was nearly past. The moment approached when the mask must be torn away, and the shadows yield their final secret. The morning air was heavy with fog, the kind that made Bedford Square seem a ghostly corridor between past and present. Whimsy had spent the previous night planning his next move, confident that Arthur's fear and arrogance would force a slip. But no precaution could have prepared him for what awaited. He arrived at the study to find Parker already pale with urgency. "It's happened, my lord," Parker said without preamble. "Hargraves. He's been attacked." "What do you mean, attacked?" Whimsy asked sharply, stepping inside. Parker handed him a note scrawled hastily in pencil. "Leave the house. Do not interfere or someone else dies." Horrified, Whimsy glanced around the room. Hargreaves had been discovered early that morning in the servants' hall, collapsed against the wall, a bruise darkening his temple and a thin stream of blood at the corner of his mouth. A heavy book had fallen near him, its spine cracked. But there were no signs of forced entry. The attack was precise, calculated, not a clumsy robbery or random violence. "The villain has escalated," Whimsy muttered, kneeling beside Hargreaves, who stirred weakly. "He is not merely defending a secret, he is daring us, testing our nerve. We are, in fact, pawns in his game." Hargreaves's eyes fluttered open. "Whimsy the draft, the pawn, it's all." His voice trailed off, leaving meaning suspended in the chill air. Whimsy pressed his hand gently. "Rest, Hargreaves. You are safe for the moment. But we must act quickly. The attack proves our man is bold, and he knows how close we are to uncovering him." Parker's face darkened. "Safe. He's unconscious and bruised. That note, it's a warning. Someone's still inside this house or has access. Who else could move with such knowledge?" Whimsy's gaze swept over the familiar walls. The well-worn bookshelves, the paintings of ancestors staring down in silent judgment. Only someone intimate with both the house and its history, one of our circle, someone who knows every routine, every door, every key. And evidently, Someone willing to kill to protect a secret long buried. He returned to his planned observation and subtle confrontation. He asked Parker to double the household watch and to keep all entrances under discreet surveillance. Meanwhile, he summoned Arthur under the pretense of discussing the next steps in the legal affairs, noting every nuance of behavior as the captain entered. Arthur greeted him with a smile that did not reach his eyes, a forced cheeriness that betrayed nervousness beneath the surface. "My dear lord," Arthur said smoothly, "I trust all is proceeding as you wish. The inquest, the evidence." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, drawing out the words. "But you must understand, Captain, that the game grows perilous. The thief, or should I say, the murderer, has now struck openly. Hargreaves assaulted, evidence vanishing. A bold stroke, don't you agree?" Arthur's hand twitched almost imperceptibly at his side. "Terrible business," he said, his voice taut. "Such things are best left to the authorities, are they not?" "Ah, yes, but authorities can be slow. Sometimes one must take matters into one's own hands." Whimsy leaned closer, voice low. "I have a notion, Captain. Whoever moves against us so boldly has underestimated my patience. They think fear will silence observation. But observation is not so easily startled." Arthur's jaw tightened. "You speak in riddles." "Perhaps," said Whimsy lightly. "Yet even riddles have answers. And sometimes the answer arrives in the smallest of gestures." That night, the house settled into tense quiet. Every creak and rustle drew the detective's attention, and when Parker fell into a light doze in the adjoining room, Whimsy moved through the study with meticulous care, noting the placement of furniture, the smallest shifts in dust or light. At 1:30, a shadow moved, a subtle flicker in the corner of the room. Whimsy did not call out. Instead, he allowed the figure to approach the desk, to reach for the inkstand. Then, with a swift motion, he stepped from the shadow, hand on his cane, voice smooth and precise. "I see you, Captain." Arthur froze, one hand still poised above the inkwell, eyes wide. The mask slipped fully this time. Panic and calculation warred visibly across his features. He attempted to laugh, to pass the motion off as casual, but it rang hollow. I merely came to what?" Whimsy prompted softly. "Replace what you destroyed. Or perhaps to take another step toward yourself," proclaimed victory. Arthur's composure fractured. His shoulders slumped, hands trembling now. You know everything?" he whispered. "I didn't mean only to protect myself, the old will. The draft, it would ruin me." "Precisely," said Whimsy, voice calm, almost gentle. "You acted out of fear, yes, but also pride. You fancied yourself cleverer than all of us, and in that confidence, you left traces too visible to ignore. The pawn, the forged letter, the destroyed evidence, they were your moves on this board. Each one revealed more than you intended." Arthur sank into a chair, defeated, staring at the floor. "I didn't intend to hurt anyone else. Only to secure my inheritance. But you underestimated time." "My dear Captain," Whimsy said, sitting across from him, "and underestimation, when combined with desperation, is fatal. Hargreaves was meant to warn you, me perhaps. But he survived, albeit bruised, because you did not anticipate intervention. Yet even now, you cannot undo what is done. Your moves, though bold, have trapped you." Parker entered silently, having overheard the confession from the doorway. The sight of Arthur, unmasked and trembling, brought a grim satisfaction. "He tried to strike again," Parker said softly. "And yet you predicted it." "Yes," Whimsy replied. "And now the net closes. A second crime. An attempt at silencing a witness. These were desperate gambits. They tell us more than words could. The true measure of guilt is revealed not in statements, but in actions, and actions, as always, betray themselves. Arthur, for the first time, met Whimsy's eyes, no longer defiant, only wary. "And now?" he asked. "Now," Whimsy said, rising, "we bring this to its conclusion. The game has been played, the moves made, and the pawn, though missing, has served its purpose. The shadow of the past cannot protect you any more. The present has caught up, outside. The fog pressed thick against the windows, but inside the study, light and clarity reigned." Whimsy knew the final act was near, and that the pieces would soon fall into their appointed places. The villain, once steps ahead, was now contained by the very design he had sought to manipulate. Yet even as the captain slumped in resignation, Whimsy remained vigilant, aware that the final, delicate twist, the last move, would decide the true outcome of the game. Whimsy sat late into the night, the room illuminated by the steady glow of the lamplight, reviewing every fragment of the case, the pawn, the forged letter, the partially destroyed evidence, Arthur's panicked movements, and the shadows of the past that had intertwined with the present. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old timbers, and even Parker had withdrawn to rest, leaving Whimsy to follow the invisible trail of logic with unhurried patience. It was then that a single, previously dismissed detail returned to him with surprising clarity. During one of the early interviews, Mrs. Price had mentioned casually that Captain Arthur always tapped twice before entering the room if he thought someone might be there. At the time, it had seemed trivial, a harmless idiosyncrasy among the many eccentricities of the household. Yet now, as Whimsy traced the sequence of events, the pattern crystallized. Twice, during the night of Sir Basil's murder, the supposedly locked doors had yielded no trace of forced entry, and twice, someone had been observed acting almost instinctively as if anticipating an intruder. The tapping, insignificant to the casual observer, was the key. It revealed an intimate knowledge of the house's rhythms and vulnerabilities, knowledge Arthur alone could claim. He had moved through the corridors confidently, adjusting his timing to avoid detection, but the habit had betrayed him to anyone attentive enough to notice. Every action thereafter, the stolen pawn, the forged letter, the half-burned document, was a continuation of that same pattern, boldness tempered by a nervous ritual. Whimsy began to map the chronology meticulously, laying it out in a series of sketches on his desk. The position of the pawn, the rag outside the door, the disturbed papers, all fell into alignment with the captain's known habits. He had entered the study in deliberate silence, moved methodically to the desk, left the pawn as a taunt or a signature, and ensured the draft was removed or obscured. The forged letter followed, designed to mislead observers into thinking the baronet had intended differently. The pattern of misdirection was almost artistic in its precision, yet each stroke bore the fingerprint of human error. The subtle tremor in Arthur's hand, the impulsive attempt to retrieve or destroy evidence, the panicked overconfidence when confronted by Whimsy's psychological test. As Whimsy traced these movements on paper, a second realization struck him: the pawn itself was more than a symbol. Its placement and subsequent disappearance were choreographed to guide observers' attention, to suggest a route of inquiry that led nowhere. Arthur had anticipated that the yard would fixate on the tangible, on the overt signs, and by doing so, he believed he could divert scrutiny from his actual strategy. It was the old principle of misdirection, executed with the cunning of a man who had lived with secrets long enough to manipulate the perceptions of those around him. Whimsy's thoughts then turned to Hargreaves and Hammond. Both had been drawn into the orbit of this deception by circumstance and loyalty, Yet neither had the full picture. Hargreaves, for all his legal skill, had relied upon the fragments of evidence and Arthur's careful half-truths. Hammond's instincts had been correct in guarding Sir Basil's interests, but he lacked the leverage to see the full scope of the captain's maneuvers. Arthur, however, had seen everything, every moment, every vulnerability, every reaction. And he had counted upon that vision to carry him beyond suspicion. A faint smile touched Wimsey's lips. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity: anticipate, manipulate, misdirect, and then react when cornered. It was a strategy grounded in psychology, not brute force. The pawn's disappearance, once alarming, now made perfect sense. It had never been merely evidence. It was a test, to see who would notice and who would overreact. When the intruder attempted to reach for the blank sheet during Wimsey's observation exercise, it was not the first move of desperation, but the second, an inevitable consequence of a man accustomed to control. He leaned back, considering the sequence: the initial murder, the removal of the draft, the carefully crafted forgeries, the destruction of the letter, the assault on Hargreaves, the subtle psychological trap. All were extensions of the same pattern. Each action fed into the next, creating a chain that linked motive, opportunity, and personality with unnerving precision. And yet, within this chain, the smallest inconsistencies, the tremor of the hand, the hurried half-destruction of documents, the involuntary gestures, were enough to reveal the truth to the attentive observer. It was then that he recalled one more seemingly trivial comment. Hargreaves, during a conversation about the Old Bailey case, had noted that Captain Arthur never liked surprises. That casual remark had appeared irrelevant at the time, a reflection of temperamental pride. Now it illuminated everything. Arthur's entire approach to the crime had been preemptive, seeking to neutralize any element that could threaten him. The pawns were moved, the letters forged, and even Hargreaves' presence had been accounted for, all to maintain control, to eliminate surprises. Yet the very hubris that allowed him to calculate so meticulously had ensured his exposure: one overlooked habit, one involuntary gesture, and the pattern became visible. Wimsey knew the time had come to act, for the web could no longer hide in shadow. The villain's methods, once opaque, now lay bare before him: a map of behavior, ritual, and calculated deception that could be traced, anticipated, and countered. The next confrontation would not rely on guesswork, but upon the clear logic of a pattern finally discerned. He called Parker quietly into the study, spreading the sketches and notes before him. "Observe," he said, pointing to the meticulous lines marking footsteps, timing, and key actions. "Everything converges here: the doors, the pawn, the forged letters, the intrusions. What seemed random was deliberate, what appeared trivial was essential. Arthur believed himself beyond detection, yet he has led us straight to him through his own habits." Parker studied the maps, eyes widening. So all along, the key was in the details. The little things that seemed irrelevant. "Exactly," Wimsey interrupted gently. "The devil is always in the details. And when the pattern emerges, as it always does, it leaves the guilty no refuge. The evidence may vanish, letters may burn, but the rhythm of a man's life, the unconscious movements, the habits and compulsions, these remain. And in them lies the ultimate proof." The realization brought with it a chill thrill. The case, once a chaotic swirl of threats, forgery, and deception, now had form. It was no longer a matter of random suspicion, but of strategic anticipation. Every act, every misstep, every subtle gesture had led to a single conclusion, and Wimsey, patient and meticulous, could finally see the board in its entirety. The house was quiet outside, but inside, a storm of logic and revelation surged. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the path to resolution. The remaining moves, once uncertain, now lay before him clearly: confront the villain, anticipate his reactions, and finally, lay bare the intricate design that had concealed murder behind layers of misdirection. For the first time since the investigation began, Whimsy allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. The pieces were in place, the pattern discerned, and the game was ready to reach its final, inevitable conclusion. Whimsy spent the morning retracing the threads of the case, piecing together the intricate latticework of deception and motive. Each clue, each seemingly minor act, had been a deliberate stroke in a larger design. Yet as the detective pondered, he realized that the surface explanations, inheritance, revenge, and old grudges, accounted for the actions only partially. The true motive had remained hidden, a shadow in the corners of every gesture and every crime, visible only when examined with patient scrutiny. He summoned Arthur under the pretense of reviewing the remaining documents of Sir Basil's estate. The captain entered the study with forced ease, though Whimsy immediately noted the subtle tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in the hand holding his cane. Every gesture, every fleeting expression, betrayed the underlying anxiety that had gone unnoticed by all others. "My dear Captain," Whimsy began, his tone casual yet pointed, "we have traced the steps of last night's disturbances and the removal of evidence. It is clear you acted with extraordinary forethought." Arthur laughed nervously, attempting to mask the flicker of recognition that passed across his features. "Forethought, perhaps. Or perhaps coincidence, as one might say. One does not intend much when there are so many variables." "Variables indeed," Whimsy said, leaning back. "But the variables have a pattern, and patterns rarely exist without purpose. That purpose, Captain, is not merely the inheritance. It is not simply the concealment of past indiscretions. No. What has driven you to such extremes is far more intimate, far more psychological." Arthur stiffened, the color draining from his face. I failed to see what you mean." Whimsy picked up the small wooden pawn, which had been recovered, cleaned, and placed in evidence. He turned it slowly in his hand. "Do you recall this object, its placement, its disappearance?" Arthur's hand twitched instinctively. "Yes," he admitted, his voice tight. "It was a symbol, nothing more." "A trivial game." "A trivial game," Whimsy echoed. "Yet the game has cost 2 lives, driven 1 man to injury, and brought the household to the brink of terror. No triviality would suffice for such consequences. Your actions suggest something far deeper. Consider your behavior throughout the investigation. The meticulous planning, the attempts to mislead, the psychological traps. These are not merely the acts of a man seeking to protect wealth. They are the acts of a man compelled by obsession." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Obsession?" he whispered. "Yes," Whimsy said, voice calm, almost gentle. "Obsession with control. Not merely over property or reputation, but over perception, over the narrative itself. The past, Sir Basil's estate, the old embezzlement case, the perceived slights and failures. These were not merely grievances. They were components of a story you sought to author. A story in which you dictated the outcome, in which nothing happened without your approval. The murders, the theft of evidence, even the attack on Hargreaves, these were means to maintain that illusion of control." Arthur sagged into a chair, unsteady. "Control? I could not bear to see the truth exposed. It would have ruined everything. My position, my reputation, I was cornered. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could stay 1 step ahead." Whimsy's gaze softened slightly. "And therein lies the true motive, Captain. It is not money, nor revenge, nor even fear of disgrace alone. It is the compulsion to dominate the story, to orchestrate events so precisely that the world moves as you wish. The moment you perceived loss of that control, you acted. Every crime thereafter was an attempt to reclaim it. Arthur's voice broke. I never meant anyone to die. I only wanted the past contained. The narrative mine. But containment requires action, and action often has unintended consequences. Whimsy said. You misjudged both time and observation. You believed your habits, your rituals, and your knowledge of the household were enough to shield you. Yet even in the most intricate schemes, human psychology betrays itself. Your need for control was so consuming that you could not resist reacting when challenged. And that very reaction exposed you. He laid the pawn gently on the desk. This object, simple and unassuming, was never meant as a clue for the authorities. It was meant as a test for yourself, a marker of your own superiority. But by leaving it in place, you revealed the pattern of your mind. You could not resist leaving a signature, even as you sought to erase all other traces. Arthur's hands trembled, gripping the arms of the chair, and Hargreaves he interfered too much. I tried to warn him, to scare him. Exactly, Whimsy said, nodding. You sought to manipulate the reactions of others as you manipulated events. Your actions were calculated, but not infallible. The human element, the involuntary gestures, the habits, the minute lapses, betrayed the underlying compulsion. You were driven not just by circumstance, but by the irresistible need to control how others perceived you, how events unfolded, how history itself might remember the story. The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. Arthur stared at the desk, his mind grappling with the revelation. So it was not merely inheritance, it was me. My need to be master of everything. Precisely, Whimsy replied. The inheritance, the legacy, the old scandal, they provided opportunity, but not motive. Your true motive lay within your psyche, the drive to control, to orchestrate, to dominate the narrative of the past and present alike. Every act was an expression of that inner imperative, and every miscalculation was evidence of the human limitations you could not overcome. Arthur slumped further, the facade of confidence gone. I suppose that explains the pawn, the letters, the attack on Hargreaves. I thought I was clever, that no one would see through it. Clever, indeed, Whimsy said, his voice steady, but cleverness cannot erase compulsion. Obsession leaves traces, and patterns emerge, even when one believes them invisible. Your need to dominate the story, Captain, has been your undoing. Parker, who had been observing quietly, nodded. So it was never about what he could gain materially. It was about asserting control, psychological dominance. Whimsy allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. Yes. And now that we understand the true motive, we can anticipate the final actions and bring the case to its proper resolution. The villain's psychology is exposed, the compulsion is evident, the pattern is complete. All that remains is to ensure the final act does not claim another victim. Arthur sank into the chair, silent and defeated. The house, once a stage of confusion and terror, seemed to settle in quiet acknowledgement of the truth finally revealed. The hidden motive, long obscured by greed and past grievances, now laid bare a profound, almost pathological need to control, to dominate, and to orchestrate life itself, even at the cost of murder. And with that revelation, the threads of the tangled mystery began to align, pointing inexorably toward the final reckoning. Whimsy spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing. The pattern had emerged, the motive revealed, and every misstep of Captain Arthur's compulsive need for control had been catalogued with painstaking care. Now, it was a matter of orchestration, a final maneuver that would draw the villain fully into the light, without giving him a chance to flee or strike again. He called Parker into the study, spreading out the reconstructed sequence of events with precise annotations. "Observe the rhythm of his actions," Whimsy said, tapping the sketches. "Every intrusion, every theft, every attempt at misdirection followed a predictable cadence. He cannot resist acting when cornered, nor can he ignore a challenge to his authority. We shall use both tendencies against him." Parker nodded, grim but ready. "And the pawn? It will serve as the bait," Whimsy replied. "We restore it to its original position in plain sight and remove every other trace of interference. He will come, drawn by the compulsion to assert control, to manipulate, to reclaim his illusion of power. And when he does, we shall be waiting." As dusk fell, the house was prepared with meticulous care. Hargreaves remained under the careful watch of Parker in the adjoining room. Though capable of intervening if necessary, the study, restored to its usual order, seemed calm and ordinary. The pawn sat on the desk, its presence small yet pivotal, the silent emblem of the trap. Arthur entered shortly thereafter, attempting casual composure. But Whimsy observed the minute betrayals of tension, the slight tremor in the fingers, the quick, almost imperceptible scan of the room, the way his eyes lingered on the pawn longer than polite curiosity would dictate. "Good evening, Captain," Whimsy said, voice light but controlled. "I trust you found the afternoon agreeable." Arthur smiled, forced and brittle. "Quite so. Merely taking a moment to review the estate's documents." "I hope I do not intrude." "Not at all," Whimsy replied. "On the contrary, your presence is most welcome. In fact, we were discussing the peculiar placement of certain items during the investigation." He gestured casually toward the pawn. "Curious, is it not? The small piece that caused so much consternation." Arthur's gaze fixed upon it, and his hand twitched ever so slightly. "Etty, it was hardly important. Simply a relic of a game. Yet a game is often more revealing than a ledger," Whimsy said softly, rising to close the distance. "Captain, the game is at an end. We understand your motive, your methods, and your compulsions. You cannot escape the pattern you have created. The pawn, the letters, the misdirection, they all bear your signature. Your need for control has been your undoing." Arthur's hands clenched at his sides. I did what I had to do. It was all calculated, precise. You cannot understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Whimsy interrupted gently. "You sought to dominate every outcome, to orchestrate events so that nothing could surprise you. But obsession leaves traces. Every misstep, every gesture, every unconscious habit has brought us here. You are cornered, Captain. Your moves are known, your compulsion mapped." Arthur's lips parted in a laugh, jagged and hollow. "Cornered? You think you have me cornered? I could leave this house in a heartbeat." "Perhaps," Whimsy replied, calm and unwavering. "But the rotes you rely upon are observed. Every door, every window, every habitual path you use to assert control has been accounted for. Escape is an illusion, just as your dominance of the situation was an illusion." Arthur's smile faltered, his eyes darting around the room. The calculated bravado that had carried him through the previous assaults, the thefts, and the psychological games began to crumble. You think you can trap me with a pawn and some papers?" Whimsy gestured toward the desk. "The pawn is not the trap itself, but the lure. Your obsession ensures that you respond predictably, and that response will leave you exposed. Stand aside." Or, he allowed the threat to hang lightly in the air, though it carried the weight of inevitability. Arthur moved suddenly, reaching toward the desk. But Whimsy's swift step intercepted him. Parker, stationed behind a subtle angle of the doorway, restrained the captain's other arm. Arthur struggled briefly, but it was evident that the careful preparation, the analysis of every habit and inclination, had left him powerless. "Release me!" Arthur shouted, panic overtaking arrogance. "You don't understand!" "I had to act." "I had no choice." "You did have a choice," Whimsy replied quietly. "The choice to step back, to let circumstance unfold naturally. But your compulsion dictated action. It is what drove the theft, the forgeries, the assault on Hargreaves. Every crime was a response to the fear of losing control, and now that compulsion has delivered you here, exposed to its natural conclusion." Arthur sagged, realizing that struggle was futile. The pattern had been discerned, the trap perfectly set. His last desperate attempts at assertion, at maintaining dominance, had played directly into Whimsy's design. There was no escape, no final twist he could conjure to reclaim the illusion of control. Whimsy allowed a pause, letting the weight of understanding settle over the room. "Your motives, once hidden beneath layers of manipulation and fear, are now laid bare. You acted out of obsession, not necessity. The world, and the lives within it, became instruments of your will. But instruments, once overplayed, break under scrutiny. And here you stand, Captain, no longer master of the narrative, but its final subject." Arthur slumped fully into the chair, the last vestiges of bravado gone. I suppose it had to end this way," he whispered. "I thought I could control everything, even the consequences. And yet," Whimsy said softly, "it is not control that marks a man, but understanding. You have taught us much about human nature, Captain, though at a tragic cost. The pattern is complete, the motive understood, and the web fully traced. Your story is finished, and the next steps are now in capable hands." Parker stepped forward, securing Arthur fully for removal, while Whimsy replaced the pawn in its box, a silent symbol of the investigation's conclusion. The detective allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The trap had worked perfectly, not through force or intimidation, but through patient observation, subtle manipulation, and a deep understanding of the human psyche. Outside, the evening fog thickened, the streets of Bedford Square quiet under the dim glow of gas lamps. Inside, the house settled into a tense calm, the final confrontation resolved with neither chaos nor spectacle, but with the quiet precision of logic fully applied. The villain, once steps ahead and driven by compulsive need for control, had been drawn into the net of his own patterns, and the intricate design of crime, deception, and obsession lay fully exposed. Whimsy stood by the window for a moment, looking out into the mist, contemplating the fragile balance between compulsion and consequence. The house, now liberated from the tension that had gripped it for weeks, seemed almost to breathe. Every move, every misstep, every subtle gesture had led inexorably to this resolution. The final confrontation, long anticipated and carefully orchestrated, had brought clarity where chaos had reigned, and justice, patient and precise, had finally been served. Whimsy had just stepped back from the desk, letting Parker escort the subdued Captain Arthur toward the waiting constables, when a soft, almost imperceptible sound froze him in place. It was the faint rustle of paper, delicate and deliberate, coming from the far corner of the study, a place that had been, until then, meticulously inspected. "Stay here, Parker," Whimsy whispered, his eyes narrowing as he approached the noise. He moved with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to reading the invisible traces of human behavior. There, tucked behind a narrow shelf of leather-bound ledgers, he discovered a small bundle of papers, hastily concealed but not carefully enough to evade a trained eye. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of discovery. The papers were folded and secured with a ribbon, the edges smudged as if handled often and in haste. As he examined them, a realization struck. These were not merely additional estate documents or private correspondence. The handwriting, at first unfamiliar, revealed itself under scrutiny. There was a careful mimicry, a deliberate attempt to imitate Sir Basil's hand, but the strokes betrayed a second person entirely. Parker leaned over his shoulder. "More evidence?" he asked, curiosity piqued. Wimsey shook his head slowly. "More, yes, but more dangerous. These papers were hidden for a reason. Someone else knew the pattern, someone else manipulated events behind the scenes, using Arthur as a tool rather than the principal actor. The case is not closed. It was never merely about the captain's compulsion. Someone else has been orchestrating from the shadows." The detective's eyes scanned the first page, and the final shock hit him with the force of revelation. The document was a draft of a letter, written in the unmistakable, elegant hand of Lady Winifred, Sir Basil's sister. Its content was damning. Not only did it outline Arthur's manipulations, but it also suggested premeditated guidance from someone with intimate knowledge of the family and estate, someone with the ability to direct events subtly while remaining invisible. Parker gasped. "Lady Winifred, but she appears above suspicion precisely because she has been careful." Wimsey completed. "She had motive, opportunity, and the intelligence to manipulate without detection. The captain's obsession was exploited, his need for control used as a lever to execute a plan designed by another mind entirely." The pieces began to fall together with staggering clarity. Arthur had been the visible hand, the actor whose compulsions produced observable patterns. Lady Winifred, however, had anticipated his behavior, planting triggers, misdirecting investigators, and ensuring that when Wimsey thought he had the pattern mapped, he had only observed the first layer of a deeper design. Wimsey's mind raced through every interaction, every subtle comment, every overlooked glance. Lady Winifred had been present during key discussions, always unobtrusive, yet never absent from the theater of manipulation. Her innocent demeanor, the soft, unassuming manner that had seemed comforting, now appeared as the perfect camouflage for a strategist who could orchestrate chaos without leaving a single trace of culpability. He realized the implications immediately. Arthur's final confrontation, the pawn, the forged letters, even the attack on Hargreaves, all had been influenced by this hidden hand. Lady Winifred had allowed Arthur to execute the overt acts, knowing that his compulsions would produce evidence, draw attention, and even temporarily mislead the detective. In essence, she had constructed a puppet whose strings were invisible to all but her. Parker's voice was hushed but urgent. "Do we confront her now?" Wimsey shook his head. "No, we must be certain. Direct confrontation now would alert her. She is cunning enough to vanish, or to destroy the remaining threads. Observation and subtle pressure will force her to reveal herself. Her actions will betray her even if words do not." He spent the next hour reconstructing the timeline once more, this time layering Lady Winifred's movements, habits, and potential interventions onto Arthur's known patterns. The subtle changes became evident. The moments when evidence was conveniently misplaced, the precise timing of Hargreaves' encounters, and the faint yet deliberate diversions during Wimsey's earlier tests. Everything now pointed to the conclusion that the true architect had remained invisible, guiding the chaos with the precision of a chess master. By nightfall, Wimsey set his plan. Lady Winifred had dined quietly in her drawing room, unaware that the detective had anticipated her every movement. He approached, calm and composed, with Parker discreetly stationed outside the door. "Good evening, Lady Winifred," he said, stepping into the room. "I trust the day has treated you kindly." The lady looked up serene, her face the picture of genteel composure. "Indeed, Lord Wimsey. Though I hear there has been considerable excitement in the house." "Excitement indeed," he replied, his voice mild. "And yet some threads remain unresolved. I find it most curious, Lady Winifred, that certain evidence, letters, documents, and even the placement of a humble pawn, has repeatedly followed a pattern not fully explained by the actions of Captain Arthur." Her expression shifted imperceptibly, a flicker of tension beneath the calm mask. Wimsey continued, letting the pause linger. "Patterns, you see, are rarely accidental. They betray the hand of a mind accustomed to control, a mind capable of orchestrating events without ever stepping into the limelight. A remarkable talent, though occasionally flawed in execution." Lady Winifred's eyes met his, sharp and calculating. "You suggest what?" "That the true architect of the chaos," Wimsey said, producing the bundle of concealed papers, "was not merely reacting to circumstance, but directing it. Captain Arthur's compulsions were exploited, his moves anticipated. The final acts, though visible, were merely extensions of a plan set long ago. And that plan," he paused, letting the words sink, "points directly to you." The lady's composure faltered for the briefest moment. A subtle tightening of the jaw, a shadow in the eyes, gestures almost too small for an untrained observer, but unmistakable to Wimsey. "Accusations are serious, Lord Wimsey," she said, her tone measured. "Indeed," he replied. "And yet evidence does not lie. The letters, the timing, the misdirections, the hidden manipulations, they form a pattern visible only when one looks beyond the obvious. A pattern that leaves little doubt as to the hand behind it all." Lady Winifred remained silent, the tension in the room taut and electrifying. She took a measured breath, as if weighing the risks of speech against silence. Finally, a faint sigh escaped her lips, a quiet acknowledgement of inevitability. "You are remarkably perceptive," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes, I orchestrated the plan. Arthur's obsession was a tool. I merely guided it. The rest was his doing, and mine in equal measure. But you have unmasked the design, Lord Wimsey." "What now?" Wimsey allowed a brief smile. "Now, Lady Winifred, justice proceeds as it must. The manipulations, the crimes, and the motives are no longer hidden. The pattern is clear, and the story, which you sought to dominate, now unfolds according to truth, not compulsion." For the first time since the investigation began, the room seemed to release its tension. The final, hidden layer had been revealed. The mastermind exposed not through force or recklessness, but through the relentless clarity of observation, logic, and an understanding of the intricate workings of the human mind. The last-minute twist had arrived, testing Wimsey's genius one final time, and he had discerned it, just as he always had, by seeing what others overlooked, and by tracing the pattern that even the cleverest minds could not fully conceal. Wimsey watched Lady Winifred carefully, the soft lamplight catching the faint lines of tension on her face. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath, the long weeks of intrigue, deception, and danger suspended in the still air of the drawing-room. Outside, the fog hung low, a ghostly curtain against the city, but inside, clarity reigned, if only for those who could see it. "Lady Winifred," Wimsey began, his voice calm, measured, and commanding attention without raising it. "The labyrinth you have woven is intricate, yes. But intricacy is no shield against observation. The evidence, as you have seen, points inevitably to your hand. Your manipulations, though subtle, have left traces that only a careful mind could discern." Her eyes flickered, an acknowledgement of both the brilliance and the danger of the man across from her. You have unraveled what I thought impervious, she said softly. And yet, what of the consequences? Whimsy's gaze swept the room. The consequences are as inevitable as the pattern you laid. Captain Arthur, while a complicit agent, has revealed through his compulsions the path of the plot. Hargreaves survived, alert to the subtleties that others overlooked. And we, through patience and attention, have traced the invisible threads you believed secure. She tilted her head, a calculating expression returning to her face. And yet you hesitate to act. You know that justice is seldom absolute. Whimsy allowed a brief, reflective silence, giving weight to her words. Justice is served not solely by immediacy, but by understanding. You have orchestrated chaos, yet it is your own design that compels resolution. Every hidden message, every subtle misdirection, every carefully timed intrusion. They were clues you believed invisible. Yet they betrayed your motive, your method, and your presence. Observing the pattern, the rhythm of your interventions, the faint but consistent deviations from chance. These are the marks of a mind exercised, but not unobservable. Lady Winifred's hands rested lightly on her lap, the elegant poise of a woman trained to command, now tinged with unease. Then it is true. You have seen all. You know the significance of each pawn, each letter, each maneuver. And yet, her lips pressed together, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her otherwise controlled expression. And yet, Whimsy continued, you remain a step removed from immediate consequence. That is not oversight, it is recognition of human complexity. We understand motives, means, and the mistakes that make detection possible. But there are always limits to the law, to circumstance, and to fortune. You have acted within a web of deceit, but the web itself has left you ensnared. She exhaled softly, and for a moment, the formidable mask of composure gave way. You are relentless, she whispered. The smallest gesture, the minutest lapse, none escape your notice. Precisely, Whimsy replied, eyes steady. The very details you thought trivial, the slight tremor in Arthur's hand, the unusual placement of a document, the minor discrepancies in timing, these were the invisible threads I followed. They form the pattern that revealed your orchestration. While Arthur was the visible hand, you were the true architect. Yet even architects leave traces of themselves, and it is those traces that define the line between crime hidden and crime revealed. Lady Winifred studied him, weighing her options, the faintest shadow of a smile touching her lips, as if intrigued by the interplay of intellect and consequence. And now, the outcome. Will the law grasp what you have deduced, or have you allowed the spider to escape? Whimsy leaned back slightly, hands resting lightly on the desk. The law is a blunt instrument, effective in some respects, limited in others. The full story, the subtle truth, cannot be reduced merely to statutes. What is certain is that the pattern, the motive, and the manipulations are known to those who understand them. Justice, in this case, is not only a matter of arrest or punishment. It is the illumination of truth. And truth, once seen, shapes future actions, limits opportunity, and constrains even the most cunning of minds. She nodded slowly, the veneer of her confidence tempered by the weight of comprehension. So you would allow me freedom, knowing that I am exposed? Not freedom in ignorance, Whimsy said softly. You are exposed. You cannot act without detection. Every move you make now will be scrutinized, every interaction analyzed. The danger is no longer hidden, it is fully visible. That is justice as it pertains to intellect and foresight. The law may act as it will, but the mind that has been understood is already constrained. Parker, standing quietly by the door, gave a subtle nod of understanding. He had followed Whimsy through countless puzzles, Yet even now he marveled at the detective's ability to render control impotent through observation alone. Lady Winifred rose, composed once more. Though there was a tension in her shoulders, a recognition of limits she had not previously acknowledged. "Then it is settled," she said, voice firm, though tempered by awareness. "You have bested me, not through force, but through insight. The pattern is revealed, and I cannot escape its implications." Whimsy allowed a faint smile. Exactly. The case, once chaotic and layered with misdirection, now stands fully illuminated. Captain Arthur's compulsion was exploited, the letters forged, the pawn misused. But the threads all lead to a single mind. And that mind is now understood, constrained, and accountable. In ways both visible and subtle. There was a long pause as the final weight of revelation settled over the room. Outside, the fog shifted. The city unchanged, but somehow more ordered, as if the truth within the house had ripple effects beyond its walls. The detective's mind raced only briefly, cataloging what remained to be done: formal reporting, careful handling of Arthur's custody, and ensuring the remaining evidence left no avenue for denial. Yet, for the moment, all that was necessary was comprehension. The recognition that the case's hidden intricacies had been brought into light. Lady Winifred finally offered a small nod of respect, a tacit acknowledgement of the precision with which the detective had unraveled the entire tapestry. "You have made the invisible visible," she said softly, "and in doing so, delivered a measure of justice that the law alone might not achieve." "Justice," Whimsy replied, voice calm and steady, "is not always a matter of imprisonment or punishment. It is the revelation of truth, the exposure of hidden patterns, and the prevention of further harm. You will act within the constraints that your own cleverness has now imposed. And in that, you are contained more completely than any locked door or guarded corridor could achieve." For a moment, silence reigned. The detective had not only revealed the villain, but also traced the subtle workings of human compulsion, exposing motives that could have eluded the casual observer. Justice had been served, yet the unsettling awareness remained. The mind capable of such manipulation, though understood, had not been physically restrained. The sense of unfinished business lingered, a faint tension in the otherwise resolved tableau, reminding all present that genius, once unleashed, is never entirely subdued. Parker exhaled softly, a mixture of relief and admiration. "Remarkable, my lord. You have seen what no one else could, traced what no one else would even consider tracing." Whimsy allowed himself a faint smile, eyes lingering on the papers, the pawn, the carefully preserved evidence. "Observation, patience, and the understanding of human nature," he murmured. "These are the tools of resolution. The law will follow in due course, but comprehension alone has already constrained what might have remained unchecked. The pattern is complete, the motives revealed, and the truth, finally, is undeniable." Outside, the fog continued to curl around the streets, indifferent to human affairs. Yet the house at Bedford Square, with its exposed schemes and illuminated deceptions, had been forever changed. The villain's mind had been revealed, her manipulations traced to their source, and though some sense of unfinished business remained, the case stood as a testament to the power of intellect, the clarity of observation, and the quiet, unyielding force of justice fully understood. Whimsy left the drawing room with Parker at his side, the fog outside thickening around the quiet streets, shrouding the city in a grey, contemplative hush. Bedford Square, so recently alive with tension and turmoil, now seemed almost peaceful. Yet there was a certain heaviness in the air, a residue of the chaos that had unfolded within the house. Even with Lady Winifred's manipulations exposed, and Captain Arthur's compulsions accounted for. The detective could not dismiss a subtle unease that lingered like a shadow at the edge of perception. As they walked down the corridor toward the front door, Whimsy's mind catalogued every detail of the investigation. The letters, the pawn, the forged documents, the stolen evidence, the pattern of misdirection, and the hidden motives. Each element had fit together in a meticulous puzzle, yet a fragment of uncertainty tugged at him, faint but persistent. Something, he realized, had been overlooked, or perhaps had revealed itself too subtly for anyone to notice at the time. At the entrance hall, the Parker handed Whimsy a small envelope that had been slipped under the door just moments before. The envelope was unmarked, its paper thick and cream-colored, with no indication of the sender. Whimsy held it delicately, noting the weight and texture, the faint smell of ink. Inside was a single card, on which a few words were written in a hand that was neither Lady Winifred's nor Arthur's, but something altogether different. The end is never truly the end. Whimsy's brow lifted ever so slightly. The message was cryptic, almost taunting, yet its implication was unmistakable. The case, intricate and seemingly concluded, might only be the surface of a larger design. The handwriting hinted at intelligence, at deliberate calculation, and at someone capable of weaving layers beneath layers of deception. He slipped the card into his coat pocket, his mind already racing through possibilities. Another hand at work, perhaps? Parker asked quietly, observing his master's thoughtful pause. Possibly. Whimsy replied, voice low but deliberate. Or perhaps it is merely a reminder that even in cases apparently resolved, the threads of human behavior continue to weave patterns we cannot fully anticipate. The question is not who sent this note, but why, and to what end. As they stepped outside, the fog pressed around them, curling against the gas lamps, softening the outlines of the city. The streets were empty, the distant clatter of a carriage echoing faintly, yet the atmosphere felt charged with invisible currents, as if secrets themselves lingered in the mist. Whimsy paused at the foot of the steps, glancing back toward the house, now dark and still. The windows reflected dimly, and for a moment he swore he could see faint movement behind the curtains, a shadow that shifted with deliberate care, watching, waiting. He walked on, Parker matching his pace silently. "Do you believe we will encounter this unknown correspondent again?" Parker asked, the question carrying more curiosity than fear. "Undoubtedly," Whimsy replied, his voice measured but certain. The human mind, when engaged in subtle manipulation, rarely stops at a single act. If this message is genuine, it is a promise, or a challenge. Either way, it indicates intelligence, foresight, and a willingness to act beyond conventional expectations. The person who wrote this understands the patterns we follow, the methods we employ, and perhaps even the limits of our perception. They turned a corner into a narrower street, the lamp light diffused through the mist, and Whimsy allowed himself a moment of reflection. The case had been long, twisting, and intricate. Captain Arthur's compulsions, Lady Winifred's manipulations, the hidden motives and stolen evidence, all had been traced and accounted for, each piece fitting into the broader tapestry of crime and psychology. Yet now, as the fog wrapped around them like a veil, he realized that resolution did not always mean finality. A lingering question remained: what did the card signify? Who had anticipated the end and left a final cryptic mark? Even the smallest detail, Whimsy mused aloud, can point to a wider design. Patterns exist beyond what we perceive, and motives extend further than the obvious. Our task is to remain vigilant, to notice what others overlook, and to trace threads that might otherwise be dismissed as inconsequential. Every case contains hidden layers, and this one is no exception. Parker glanced at him, a mixture of admiration and unease in his expression. "So you intend to investigate further?" Whimsy gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Investigation is never truly finished. To assume so is to ignore the subtleties of human behavior. We have resolved the visible acts, uncovered the motives, and revealed the manipulations. But there is always more beneath, always a shadow behind the light. That is the nature of our work, and the very reason it endures." As they continued down the fog-laden streets, Whimsy's eyes swept the windows, the doors, the corners where shadows pooled. Every subtle movement, every glint of light, became a potential clue, a signpost to future intrigue. The night, calm yet charged with invisible currents, promised more challenges, more puzzles, and more minds to outwit. Reaching the edge of the square, Whimsy paused once more, glancing back at the distant silhouette of the house. It appeared ordinary, yet he knew differently. The history, the secrets, the hidden hands all lingered within its walls. Justice had been served, yet the card remained a quiet provocation, a reminder that the resolution of one case did not preclude the emergence of another. Parker's footsteps echoed softly beside him. "Do you think this will lead to another mystery?" "Without question," Whimsy said, his tone confident yet contemplative. "The evidence is subtle, but unmistakable. Someone, somewhere remains engaged in unseen activity. Whether they seek mischief, justice, or revelation, we shall see, but only by vigilance, patience, and careful observation. A puzzle never truly ends, it only evolves." The fog deepened, swallowing their figures as they walked onward, leaving Bedford Square and its secrets behind, yet carrying the weight of unresolved possibilities. Whimsy's mind, ever attentive, catalogued patterns, connections, and anomalies, aware that in every shadow, every pause, every silent observer, there could lie the next challenge. And as the night stretched on, quiet but alive with unseen motion, one truth remained undeniable. The world of mystery was unending, and the keen mind that pursued it could never rest. Even as one story closed, another waited, quietly, deliberately, just beyond perception, ready to test observation, logic, and the inexhaustible patience of a detective who saw what others could not. With that thought, Whimsy and Parker disappeared into the mist, leaving behind a house full of resolved intrigues, a city unaware of the subtle currents of human cunning, and a final, cryptic message that promised the continuation of a mystery that would never truly end.